Hey everybody, I'm Mark.
And I'm John, and welcome to Questions on Tap, where we drink whiskey and talk about, well, just about anything. Today, we're going to be debating about objective morality and whether or not it exists at all. Or is morality purely subjective, and it's a culture or society's kind of ability to decide what's right and wrong for its people? I think this will be an interesting discussion. It'll go in a lot of different territories, and frankly, we could do an entire series on this. So maybe we will. If you like it, leave a comment. Tell us to do a whole series about it.
Yeah, I think this is one of those that honestly is on my mind a lot. Something that I'm just kind of constantly thinking about, like in terms of leading your best life and all that. But yeah, kind of exciting. Me and John took a little break from recording for a little bit just over the holiday season, getting back into it now. So yeah, this is kind of just going to start. We're going to start talking about it. So I'll pose the first question, just kind of the baseline. John, does objective morality exist?
100%, of course.
I think we'd probably both agree on that.
Really? The Mark I knew a few years ago would have said something very different.
I don't think he would have. I don't think I've ever been a relativist fully. I think that's a dangerous path to go down. I think we both would agree on that.
No, I wouldn't call you a relativist 2 years ago, but I also wouldn't say that you were a huge supporter of objective morality either. So this is intriguing. I'm curious to see why.
I guess I think subjective morality can lead down dangerous roads.
Oh yeah, you and I would be in complete agreement with that, because there is no, if everything's subjective, then it's very hard to defend what's right and anything that's outside of our own pocket of existence. And if we can't defend what's right outside of our own little bubble, then what are we doing? Kind of thing.
I think it's very hard to be able to describe to somebody what's right or tell somebody else they're wrong if everything's subjective.
Yeah, which is why I think it's really interesting that it appears that like moral relativism is kind of at an all-time high. I would say, at least from like a American Western cultures. Yeah, I think most people are fairly comfortable with morality being subjective. I think if they think about it for a while, I think they realize there's some issues with that. But I would still say that even people thinking about it, that more people would side with it's subjective. You kind of let people do what they want, kind of thing. Which I see the logic if you're thinking of it like from a freedom perspective, that like it's weird. Well, I think we're very uncomfortable just as a human species trying to say what's objectively right or wrong.
Yeah, it's really hard to, I think for a lot of people, it's hard to look at other people in another country and say what they're doing is wrong because, they've lived their life. I know people in my life, I've had conversations with them about this, and it's that similar philosophy. Like, we can't say what's wrong with them because they exist somewhere else outside of our culture, outside of our place. And yeah, that just seems pretty dangerous in general, because then I feel like anything can be okay if you have some justification for it.
I agree, and I also think part of the reason maybe people are uncomfortable talking about objective morality is because, all right, my friend Joe is doing something that I think is wrong, and if he asks me my opinion and I tell him, well, I think you shouldn't be doing that, or I think that's objectively wrong, I think we live in a world in which, understandably so, we don't want to judge others, and meaning like you don't want to be a judgmental person. And so I think, which I would agree with, but I think we've overcompensated in the sense that we assume that because someone has a certain belief about morality, that means that they're judging a person for it. Sometimes they are, but you can hold a belief system without being a judgmental person and thinking of them as less or thinking of them as a bad person, kind of thing. Like, it's not like an all-encompassing thing.
I think there's a balance between like saying an action somebody does is wrong versus saying like that person is wrong or that person is bad versus simply the action they have performed is. And I think, a lot with our day and age, that's kind of become one that people too often kind of, if someone says something you did was bad, they take it as somebody else saying, I'm a bad person. And I feel like it's hard to have discussions in that way.
No, and I don't actually think most people think that way.
No.
No, or at least
No, I
I
wouldn't think
don't,
they do.
and I know most people in my life don't. And I think if you really get down to it, even if something really bothers you, you don't judge a person by one slice of their life and their choices that you think that they're governing their lives by. Because I think everyone understands, especially as you get older, how complicated life is, how everyone has a different experience and stuff like that. But objective morality
there's like a hard balance.
Despite that.
No, I would agree, but I think it's a hard balance of like, yeah, okay, so like this person does something that I think is objectively wrong, right? But that doesn't make them bad, but I think it's a hard balance, and I can see why it easily leads into them thinking them as a person is bad, because your actions can define you. Like, you're more than your actions, but they definitely lead into what does define you.
And ultimately,
so I think it's a tough balance.
And ultimately, I would say, like, your actions are ultimately kind of like how people see you, more than anything.
Yeah. It's the only thing. It's the only way other people can see you. They can't see your thoughts or really know, unless you have a podcast and talk about it a lot.
Yes, that's true. But I think part of it is also like, I think there are certain actions that we are understandably very quick to say, like, that action is terrible. You are a bad person for doing that action. And I think that is sometimes fair. But it's also like, is it more complicated than that? I mean, maybe that's not fair. You know what I mean? We can certainly say that the action is abhorrent, but does that mean that they're 100% a terrible person? I mean, I think that the emotional part of me wants to say, you know, if an action is so bad, then yes, they must be, but then where do we draw the line? Kind of like, what's the marker of like, you've crossed this threshold? It's like a sign in the road, like, you've gone far enough. If you go this way, this is a dead end. You need to turn around.
Yeah.
Like, is there a point?
And it's really hard to understand the context. Yeah, no, definitely. And it's hard to understand the context at which those decisions were made. Like, to really be able to jump from it's a bad action to a bad person is almost impossible, because there's so many factors to take into account. Like, whether it's factors we know of or we're not aware of.
Yeah. And I think, like, an example of this is probably like a good example. Stealing, I would say, is like an objectively wrong thing. You should not steal from people. But there's a difference between someone who is desperate and is stealing to live versus someone who is stealing for, like, they're just stealing money for financial gain. Maybe it's, you know, an employer or a person, whatever it is. And so, like, I know, like, for example, like the Christian church has like different ways of dealing with like stealing out of desperation because you're starving versus stealing just for
the
money's sake,
the classic question, of would you steal like a slice of bread or a loaf of bread to save your family, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think, like, I would say yes to that. Actually, and I think
you should steal it.
I mean, I would think that that's a moral decision. I know, like, I took a theology class that was taught by a moral theologian, and there's kind of room in Christianity and Catholic thought, because she was a practicing Catholic, and she talked about how there's kind of room in Catholic social teaching for that kind of act, that it is an injustice in a sense that that kind of desperation even exists, and perhaps that stealing is actually like righting that wrong in a way, because you're not stealing more than what is needed. I think it's complicated, though, to be clear. I just think that, like, there's room for that kind of hard situation, which is kind of going maybe down a different path than what we meant to, but, like, we can go down this rabbit hole.
Well, that's what this is for.
Yeah.
No, but I think that's an interesting one, because I think if there is room for, like, this situation makes it okay, then I don't know if it's objectively bad or situationally. Like, I think that's where, to me, it's a weird line that if something's, like, to me, if something's objectively good or bad, it's almost good or bad in, like, every situation, where you can think of a lot of situations that I would think stealing is a net good, you know?
See, I think I would disagree, actually, on that. I think something can be objectively bad, but the context maybe makes the other alternative worse. In a sense, like, if would I steal a loaf of bread to feed my family? the act of stealing is never a good thing. Like, if we're talking about this in like a binary, then I would still say that the act of stealing is bad. But is it not worse to, you could feed your family, but you're going to choose to let them starve out of pursuing righteousness? Is that righteous at all, in a sense?
I'm trying not to jump back to a past episode when we talked about letting somebody die
versus
choosing.
I said
so I'm not going to go down that road.
No, but like kind of like that. Like maybe it is like the purest moral act for the family unit is to do nothing. But is there kind of a gray area, like you can do the bad act for good mean? Like, I mean, like, kind of like the end. I don't, as a rule of thumb, I don't believe the ends justify the means in general. But
I feel like as you're talking about this, you've like slightly contradicted yourself.
No, I don't think I have.
Like I feel like no, but the ends don't justify the means, right? But stealing like is okay with the whole idea that like things can be objectively bad but better than worse. Well, does being better than worse make it good or just less bad?
I think at one, I'm going to say my initial thoughts, but I think as we go through this conversation, I may clarify it later, just kind of knowing myself.
Okay, yeah, sorry if I jumped in.
No, you're not jumping. I'm just saying this is a good question. I think right now I'm leaning towards less bad.
Okay.
If we're speaking in the binary of good and bad. But I mean, there's lots of things. I would say for every objective moral thing, for most objective moral things, I can think of a situation in which you can justify it.
There are only a couple things. And like, I remember having to think about this in like different philosophy classes I take. Are there any things that are bad in all situations? There's only a couple that I can think of that I couldn't think of a caveat that would make it okay. Or make it less bad than the other alternative.
Yeah, like, I think I'm.
I feel like for me,
boat. Yeah. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, I feel like. I feel like for me, like rape is one of those things. I have never thought of a situation or found a situation where it could be justified.
Oh yeah, so
as just like.
Yeah.
Yeah, just starting with that, like that, I feel like
that
is
was the number one
always
thing in
wrong.
my mind. That like that is always wrong.
Yeah, right.
Like in my head, honestly, when I was thinking of the first thing that came to my mind was, like what is an action that there is no possible. It's 100% evil.
Yeah.
And I think that is certainly one of them.
I would agree. Yeah.
So I think, but like, in some ways, that's like a unique case if you think about it. Like I think for most actions,
yes.
Like even something like again, stealing was an option. Lying, I would say lying is a bad thing, but when compared to the polar opposite of it. Like, you know, the stereotypical question of your spouse asks you, do I look fat in this? And
oh my God. I did not know you were going to go with that one.
Well, it's a lighthearted one. Like, if like,
it is. It's funny.
You say yes? Like, do you really say yes? I mean, now, before anyone gets on me and says, well, you don't have to say yes, but you can like phrase it in such a way that like, oh, like I think this would look better. Like, that's not the point here. The point is that
no,
like, if you have the two options, is lying the better option? I don't know. I would say I would still consider lying wrong, but I think most people would socially kind of accept on a societal level that perhaps lying is worth like preserving the like happiness of your day, because there is a right answer to that question for your relationship. The answer is always no.
And it's not only like the short-term happiness, but also like the goodness of your long-term relationship, your long-term happiness, their long-term happiness, not like
100%,
that situation. Yeah. I feel like,
but that's what I mean. Is that like or like?
Well, yeah. See, lying is one that's like so hard because I feel like there's so many situations where it's where I think lying can result in a net positive. But that's saying it's objectively bad is hard for me.
Well, but the thing is that like I think using the ends as a measurement of success is wrong. I guess that's
I think I agree that the ends don't justify the means all the time. Like I think that's like that baseline again can be dangerous. But if we're not looking at the end to be able to talk about why something could be good or why something could be bad, where do we start?
I think you have to, and this is the like religious person in me, I think you have to look at what is the act doing for the person's soul or for who they are as a person. And you don't even want to think about a religious, which we can talk about. We'll probably get into religion a bit, but think about like what is it doing for the individual? Even if the result is positive, how is it impacting them? Is it making them a better person? And as a religious person, I would say, there's a term called sanctification in Christianity, which is the idea of like, sanctification is the process of becoming perfect. The idea that like, when you're in heaven, you're perfect. How do you become perfect? There's a process of sanctification. And does that
this
act
is not
sanctify
related?
You? Yeah.
This probably is unrelated. But if heaven is perfect, wouldn't dying be the sanctification? Like becoming perfect?
Yeah.
Or is that just like way too simplistic of a look?
I mean, no. I think there's something that we don't... There's questions we can't answer of like, all right, if we go to heaven after we die, and we are perfect in heaven, but we die an imperfect person, is our death... Like when we die, are we just sanctified right away? Is there something that does that? There's a lot of different theological answers to that question.
Okay, that's fair. That was just kind of a sidetrack.
I have my own perspective on it, kind of. Like for example, in the Catholic, like I'm not Catholic, but in Catholicism, there's the answer of purgatory. Purgatory is that final step of sanctification. I am Lutheran. In the Lutheran Church, we do not believe in purgatory. I'm a bit of a weird Lutheran where I'm kind of okay with purgatory if it exists in a certain kind of way. But like the more stereotypical purgatory definitions, I'm not a huge fan of. But the idea that like there is something that sanctifies you along the way, sure. If we want to name that purgatory, fine.
Yeah,
but like I think trying to define
totally fair. I didn't mean to go down the rabbit hole.
This is perhaps a separate podcast, or maybe I'll do a
probably.
Solo
I'd let
thing
that be
at some
interesting.
point. But I think the idea being that like I think too often in that instance we try to define something that's undefinable. To answer your question.
Okay, no, I think that totally makes sense.
But I think theoretically
that was just like
could
a
be
quick
that you
intrigue.
just die and you're sanctified. Like that's totally like a legitimate point, I would say.
Okay, but sorry, yeah, so going back to what you were talking about earlier, I didn't want me to go totally off track. I was just curious, but about the idea that the action you do, the baseline action, is what like can purify you or make your soul worse. Is
like
that
in accordance with? Yeah, like is kind of thinking like again from a religious perspective, like is that action bringing you closer to God? Is that something that is beneficial for you? Like actually in some ways when we talk about sin or just things, like religion, we'd use the word sin. Secularly, we would just say like wrong acts, evil acts.
Yeah.
I would say from like from like a Christian perspective, in some ways that like obviously the action, if it hurts someone, that's part of what makes it bad. But there's also the part of it is that part of what makes something a sin is that it actually hurts you. That even if the end result for society is good, if it hurts you, if it's actually like sin, it's just kind of defined and described as like a corrosive force. Is it something that corrodes you? Is it something that brings you farther away from God, or in a secular way? Is that something that brings you farther away from being a good person, farther away from like being a perfect person, kind of thing? Because no one can achieve perfection in their human life, but.
I would agree with that.
But yeah, I think that's a practical reality. But like, is it pushing you farther away from that goal? And I think that is how we should measure if something is an objective right or wrong. Is does that action bring you closer to the utmost good? From a religious perspective, that utmost good is God. From a secular perspective, you can define it however you want. Well, you can and you can't. But we'll get into that, but like the point is that like whatever the good is, then is that bringing you closer to it? So it's how it impacts the person doing the act and having the thoughts and doing the decisions is just as important as the result of it.
I think, it sounds like essentially what you're saying is that the result doesn't matter at all in defining whether it's a good or bad action if we're talking in that binary. Is that an accurate synopsis?
I wouldn't say that the result doesn't matter, but it certainly isn't the primary one, I would say.
Okay.
Like, here's what
so yeah, I guess
like if something's it's like, good, yeah. Like if something's a good action, it probably has a good result. So I would say good, objectively good actions don't have bad results. Objectively bad actions may have short-term external good results, but they still have internal bad results. And so perhaps
I think
a better measurement of good and bad, or good and evil, however you want to look at it, is actually the internal results in some ways. Not because the external ones don't matter. They certainly matter a lot, especially to those that are affected by them. But it's kind of a hard measurement, and it's a subjective measurement. And it's very situational. I mean, it's
hard to measure. Yeah, it's very hard to measure like internal, external, good, bad. But I do agree with you that it's much harder to think of an objectively good thing that results in something bad than it is to think of something that could be objectively bad that results in something good. Like, I feel like we can all think of situations really quickly for the second one, but it's much harder for like something objectively good that can be bad. Like, how is picking something up for someone who dropped it, just walking on the sidewalk, how could that result in something bad? It's hard to think about it in like a quick way. So I'll totally agree with you on that. And I think, yeah, the idea that like the ends don't justify the means kind of, we mentioned that earlier. I think it's an excellent way of looking at it, because I would agree. I don't think that the like external short-term ends should justify the means. But I think it's, I get sometimes in society where it's hard to talk about and hard to think about it because you can't quantify any of that, you know? You can't quantify the internal or the external, good or bad. Like putting numbers on morality, or even like on a scale of 1 to 10, how good something is or bad, it's so difficult to do and to understand all the factors that I can see in our society where it can get kind of confusing. But yeah, I do certainly agree on the idea that the ends don't justify the means. I think it's just a hard one to kind of wrap your head around. Because for me, initially, it's really easy to think about, okay, well, saying this lie, oh, it can result in all this good things, like with your like significant other asks how this dress looks or something like that. It's one of the, that can result in just way more good in one direction than the bad in the other. But I wouldn't say lying is a good thing.
Yeah, and so
I don't know if I would go as far as saying it's necessarily a bad, but I don't know.
See, and I know a not specific instance we disagree. Like, I mean, I think lying's always a bad thing. But
yeah, like we could debate different topics and be like, this is good versus this is bad. But as a whole, just the idea of objective morality.
Yeah. No, but I think, but the interesting thing is with that example with like your spouse or your significant other is if you have to lie, which, you know, like you should not tell your spouse that they look fat and what they're wearing. I think that's a given. But if you have to lie, is that not a deeper sense of something that's wrong? Like, is there not meaning that like, if you're looking at your partner and all that you see, and obviously there's nothing wrong with saying someone looks better in one kind of apparel than someone else, than something else.
I mean, if I like the color blue versus pink, or something like that, as stereotypical as that is, and I see them wearing blue, I might like that more. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Like something as simple as that.
No, exactly. Or like, and we all have different kinds of dress that we wear that we look better in than others.
I love flannels.
Yeah, you look Boehner in flannels.
See, he knows. Look at that.
I like wearing like I think I look good in like sports jackets with like a collared shirt and unbuttoned. Like, and that's pretty basic for most guys, but that's an easy one. But if like you look at your spouse and you don't see the beauty in them and all you're seeing is a superficial flaw, then is that not like a sign of something deeper? Let's get into a separate discussion. But like, I'm just saying in that example, that lie, what makes it wrong is not the intention is good to persevere, to like preserve their feelings. And obviously even something as simple as saying that can have long-term impacts on someone's mental health.
Yeah.
But internally for the person that's doing the lie, is that not it could be a sign that there's something more there. That's actually like the fact that you have to lie. There's something wrong.
Okay, so I guess, I could see the idea that, like, the fact that you have to lie in the first place is kind of where the badness can come from.
Like, if you don't find them beautiful anyway, whether it's a man or a woman, like, whether if you have to, like, lie anyway.
It's probably not a great baseline to start from.
Yeah, you shouldn't have to lie.
Yeah. No, I think I would totally agree. I think it's interesting. That's what I'm going to have to sit on. If the idea that you have to lie in the first place is the problem, I like that way of thinking about it. That's what I'm going to have to sit on.
The lie is almost a moot point in my mind. Like, the lie is bad, but it's not because, like, the intention's good, but the lie is a symptom, actually, of a larger issue.
Okay, interesting. Okay. I'll sit on that one. I'll get back if we do another episode on this. But I want to pose another question here.
Yeah.
That might lead into, like, a separate episode, kind of cut off. We'll see. If there is such thing as objective morality, where does it come from and how did we get it?